This is an interview with Professor Andrew Shtulman, a cognitive development psychologist who studies how intuition, imagination, and reflection shape the way we learn science. He's a professor of psychology at Occidental College, studied at Princeton and Harvard, and is the author of Scienceblind and Learning to Imagine. You can read more about Professor Shtulman on our website, 6degrees.blog, and our Instagram page, 6degreesaway. Thank you and enjoy this interview.
What first inspired you to pursue cognitive development psychology, focusing on how people form intuitive beliefs? I understand that even as an undergraduate, you studied whether misunderstandings of evolution correlated with rejecting the theory. How did that early research experience shape your path forward and clarify the kinds of questions you wanted to investigate?
hmm Um, I was drawn to psychology because I was interested in why people believe weird things, and also why they don't believe claims that are scientifically and empirically supported. So, like, I think it all started really in high school when, in biology class, there were certain students who requested they be allowed to leave the classroom whenever evolution was brought up because they came from very religious families. And I just found that fascinating, that they were uninterested in even hearing, what evolution was about. At the same time, I remember finding the concept of evolution very counterintuitive. And it was really challenging for me to figure out what people meant by evolution and natural selection. And so those sorts of issues sort of just percolated in the back of my head as I became a psychology major. Originally, I thought I would be a philosophy major, or even like a religious studies major to try to figure out like why it is that some claims are appealing to some people but not other people. Um, but more just to be able to like argue in favor of the claims that I believed in. And then I realized I was less interested in winning an argument and more interested in just figuring out why there's this difference in belief. And that led down the road of discovering intuitive theories and how it is that we form intuitive ideas about the world that can prevent us from learning more accurate scientific theories. But intuitive theories tend to be more consistent with superstitious, supernatural explanations for how things work.
Could you share key moments from your academic journey from Princeton to Harvard to joining Occidental College that influenced your approach to research and teaching? Were there mentors or formative experiences during your training that sparked your interest in intuitive theories and conceptual change? And how did they shape your methods and priorities?
Sure. As an undergraduate, I realized that I really enjoyed research. At Princeton, we had to do a large empirical project, an honors project to graduate, or a thesis. And most of my peers were not having much fun doing theirs, but I really enjoyed it. And that's sort of when I realized that maybe research is the path for me. But in terms of topic, I wasn't necessarily set on any given topic. I applied widely and I ended up working with Susan Carey, who's an expert on conceptual development and conceptual change. And, in working with her and taking classes in that environment, I really honed an interest on intuitive theories and conceptual change specifically. Um, yeah, because part of it's just sort of curiosity about how it is we come to understand the world around us and how people hold different understandings. But also another part of it, when you really dig deep, is engaging with the theories that people have already put forward and thinking about the data that people have already generated, and how to build on that scientific foundation of psychology.
I mean, yeah, me and Keon just spoke to another professor that was talking about that, how nowadays, and it's becoming more and more difficult to stand out in an academic sense
hmm
because there's already so much research done. Do you struggle finding an angle, finding something to stand out in?
Certainly, that's the main struggle in graduate school, trying to define a research agenda that is unique, but at the same time, like compelling to your peers, so that yes, someone wants to hire you and allow you to continue doing research, and it's not obvious what that is. Like you have to build on what other people are doing and be in conversation with current academic theories, studies, but at the same time, you also need to like make a name for yourself and do something different. So bridging that or finding that balance is pretty difficult. But you know, as you get more skilled at it, it gets easier, particularly as you start collaborating with other people. Like I would say some of my best ideas have come from collaborations with other people. We've constructed the ideas collectively.
Hmm. You have described how we all develop intuitive theories about reality from early childhood. What are intuitive theories, and why do our minds generate these common sense ideas about how the world works? How can such gut level theories be both helpful in daily life and a hindrance when learning scientific concepts, and what does that tension reveal about human cognition?
Right. So an intuitive theory is a set of beliefs that help you interpret the world around you, explain events in the past, predict events in the future. And they are the reason they're intuitive is that they're not taught to you in any kind of formal context. We devise them on our own. Um, and the reason they're theories is because they are um, cohesive and they function like a scientific theory, even though they don't have the same level of precision or accuracy as a scientific theory. And the fodder for intuitive theories comes from sort of our innate perceptual abilities. We come into the world perceiving it in particular ways because we expect there to be, say, physical objects and intentional agents and so we have like certain habits of perception that feed into our theories. Another source of input is culture, what the people around us tell us. Sometimes that's accurate information, other times it's more like folklore. And then a third input is your own experiences in the world. And uh, yeah, the when you intervene on a situation, when you act on something, you gain some information about how the world works just from kind of informal experimentation. So we put all that together to create a theory, but usually those theories are impoverished because we're the only ones putting this stuff together, whereas a scientific theory has benefited from decades, if not centuries, of many people working on the same topic, running experiments, thinking through ideas, refining the logic of the theory. So, you know, what we put together on our own is usually a good start, but definitely not as powerful an understanding as provided by science.
So you think psychology is still forming its base right now?
Psychology is one of the newer sciences. I mean, we're probably I mean, depending on where you put the start, we're a century to maybe 125 years old. Whereas, you know, physics, people have been working on physics for many centuries. So psychology doesn't yet have like unifying theoretical frameworks like a lot of the other sciences do. Like biology, for instance, has genetics, it has evolution, it has cell theory. Psychology is still kind of finding its footing in terms of like core truths that cut across all of the topics we're interested in.
Your research indicates that learning formal science does not completely erase naive intuitions, and that even college students hesitate on counterintuitive facts such as human descending from sea animals or the Earth orbiting the sun. What are the implications of this lingering intuition effect for how we learn and teach science over a lifetime, and how should educators respond to it in a curriculum and assessment?
Yeah, so the last maybe 15 years of research on conceptual change has really revealed that even if you learn a new theory, a scientifically accurate theory, you never give up on your older intuitive ideas. They linger and they are triggered by everyday contexts in which you constructed those theories in the first place. So I mean, the challenge for a science instructor is to help people realize that when they leave the science classroom, even though they might have mastered the content, they still hold misconceptions that will easily spring to mind, and kind of recognize when those misconceptions might arise. And then the challenge for just an individual, we like to think of ourselves as well educated, but many of our attitudes and our beliefs are based on intuition rather than some kind of empirical fact. And so that's something to always be aware of. That we even someone who's very educated, very smart, will always fall prey to intuitive ideas because they just resonate with how we thought about the world before we received our formal education.
Across the scientific domains you have studied including physics, biology, and psychology. Are there particular concepts that people consistently struggle with due to misleading intuitions? Why do you think certain misconceptions, such as in evolution or mechanics, are especially persistent? Could you give an example of an intuitive belief that even well-educated adults find hard to shake, and explain what that example tells us about the process of conceptual change?
Um, yeah, I mean, we have intuitive ideas about everything, really. Any phenomenon um, that's just part of our existence. We don't um, hold off and um, uh, just remain unopinionated. We tend to form beliefs about how that thing works, um, and some of those beliefs are particularly robust and resistant to instruction. Yeah, I think you mentioned evolution and mechanics as two examples. I think I point out in my book Scienceblind that those are particularly challenging to learn because most people never learn them. They're typically it's not until the later years of high school where you actually learn evolution by natural selection or Newtonian mechanics. And when you do learn, people might be able to pass a test on those concepts. They learn sort of formal definitions. They learn how to manipulate equations, solve um, toy problems, but it hasn't changed their qualitative reasoning on the topic. Like when they think about the living world, they tend to think just not entertain the idea that things evolved at all. When you think about the physical world, we tend to think of objects as moving because there's forces that are imparted to an object. This idea of inertia, which is like one of Newton's key insights, is just totally foreign. So, like when an object rolls across the table, a ball rolls across the table, we assume the reason is because when we pushed it, there's a force that was imparted to the object, and that force is what keeps it moving at a distance once it's left our hand. As opposed to thinking about objects always being in motion and that forces change that motion. That's just, we can learn that in theory. We can learn Newton's principles and the equations based on those principles, but just how we reason about object motion, um, we never really give up on this idea of internal forces.
Many anti-scientific beliefs from hesitancy to, sorry, he- hesitancy, sorry, to flat Earth ideas can feel aligned with common sense, such as doubts about injecting children with germs or skepticism that humans could alter a whole planet's climate. Based on your work, why do people trust these gut feelings over expert consensus? How do our intuitive expectations make scientific truth seem unbelievable, and how can understanding this help us address science denial in the public sphere?
Yeah. So our intuitive theories are going to push us toward beliefs that are consistent with those theories. And so a vaccine, just on the face of it, sounds kind of ridiculous because what you're doing is you're essentially um, uh, injecting a version of the virus or some part of the virus to get you to train your immune system to attack it, respond to it, and attack it appropriately. But like, just on its face, why would you inject yourself with a component of the thing that you're trying to avoid, right? Um, So intuition is part of the problem. The other part is just figuring out who in society you should trust, because we have like a division of labor in terms of like what people are entrusted to do, and um, the scientists have their own methods of study, their own forms of communicating with each other, and to trust a scientist in some ways is just to kind of have blind faith, because most people don't know what scientists do. When they don't know how to read a scientific paper. Um, uh, but it's part of the education system to get you to understand the scientific method, and that even if you're not part of science, as you grow up and you're an adult who can make all your own decisions, that the knowledge that emerges from that community has been vetted in a way that other kinds of messages have not. So yeah, there's both like a content component, which is where intuition comes into play. Some claims just seem more right because they're more intuitive, and then there's also an evidence component where you have to really trust people who are doing generating evidence on a daily basis, because they're the ones that are best informed about what beliefs you should hold, what claims you should accept as true.
But I'm sure some scientific institutions are paid to have an agenda, right? So,
Yeah, no, it's very complicated. It's not, I don't mean to say like trust any and all scientists. Even within science, there are quack ideas that are floated around, and people who have PhDs who push ideas that are not actually endorsed by the rest of their community. There's uh, it said that like 97% of climate scientists accept that climate change is happening and is caused by humans. But that means like 3% don't. So you do have to wonder like what's going on with that 3%. And I mean, it's possible for any given person to like try to dig into the science themselves, but usually you're going to get to a point where you just have to trust other people because you don't have the technical or methodological expertise to really understand what's going on. So it's a bit of a mess when you from an epistemological point of view, that uh, we live in a very complicated society where the knowledge that's out there is sort of beyond the level for the average person to really understand themselves. So you have to kind of get good at figuring out who to trust, who to be skeptical of. But science is a good start. Scientists generally are doing the work to make their claims trustworthy in a way that a lot of folks just on YouTube are not.
research shows that even many college students do not fully grasp what counts as evidence in science. In an age of misinformation and pseudoscience, how can educators and communicators improve public scientific literacy on this front? What concrete strategies would you suggest for helping people recognize the difference between a claim supported by rigorous evidence and one based on anecdote or intuition?
Yeah, this gets back to like the last question. Um, I guess, for someone who's not, if you're skeptical, say, of getting a vaccine and you want to like learn more, chances are you're not necessarily going to understand a scientific publication on the vaccine, but just the existence of scientific publications and the existence of like a whole community that's been working on this problem is evidence that, you know, the vaccine is not coming. It's not just been concocted without any thought or logic behind it. Whereas other claims, when you kind of dig into them, you'll discover that it's just an echo chamber of people saying the same things, but there's no factual basis at the end of the day. There's no studies being conducted. There's no debate within a community. It's sort of just claims that have been taken at face value. So it's more of deference to other people's authority as opposed to deference to actual evidence.
Your book, Scienceblind, explores the homespun ideas about how the world works and their impact on how we learn science. What motivated you to write this book for a general audience? Could you highlight one or two of the most striking intuitive misconceptions the book examines and explain how recognizing these hidden beliefs can help readers see scientific reality more clearly?
So I wrote Science Blind because when I was in graduate school, I realized that there were very rich literatures on intuitive theories that the average person didn't know anything about. I think it's pretty obvious that people hold misconceptions and that children have ideas about how things work that aren't the right ideas. But the sort of the depth of those misconceptions and like the coherence of children's alternative views of the world, I think the average person wouldn't know. Like a student shows up in a science classroom in middle school. They're not a blank slate. They have just a very rich and detailed understanding of how things work that is helpful in their daily lives, but is actually inconsistent with the science they're about to be taught. So that was the point of Science Mind, help people appreciate like the richness and depth of these intuitive theories and their prevalence. If I was going to point to like one misconception that's sort of always lingering around. It's this idea that being cold makes you catch a cold. Uh, what makes a person fall ill is germs. Picking up on getting a virus, and that will cause a cold or a flu. But for some reason, across cultures, people have decided that getting cold by not being dressed properly when you go outside in the winter, or getting wet and not getting dry fast enough, like that experience itself is what makes you sick. Um, Maybe indirectly it's related in the sense that it could cause you stress, and then stress weakens the immune system. But if you don't already have a virus sort of lingering in your body, just being cold will not make you sick. So there are actually a lot of experiments that were done in the US in the 1950s, funded by the government, where they would take healthy groups of individuals and they would put them in cold rooms and they'd have to stay there for a long time. And some of them had rhinovirus shot up their nose with a little nasal spray, and others had no virus injected. And only the people that had the virus injection got sick. The people that were just cold for a long period of time did not get sick.
Oh, I don't. I always thought that if you were cold, your body was working harder, so it didn't have as much, I guess, time to work on your immune system, I guess. I don't know. Very
Yeah.
superficial.
Well, there's also another correlation between the winter months and flu season, which is probably another reason why people connect them in their heads. And then that happens because the flu survives out of the body for longer in cold climates. Like if you sneeze and you then touch a doorknob, it will stick around longer on a cool day rather than a hot day. And then people are also like crammed into inside in the winter and more likely to like breathe on each other and share germs in the winter. So there's reasons why we associate being cold and getting a cold, but it's the actual coldness is not what causes the cold.
In your book, Learning to Imagine, you argue that imagination is not an inborn trait that fades with age, but a skill that expands with knowledge and education. How does acquiring knowledge fuel our imaginative capabilities? What evidence convinced you that children's imagination is rather impoverished until enriched by learning? What are the implications for nurturing creativity in both kids and adults?
So my second book, Learning to Imagine, is about the development of imagination, and the main argument is that we're not born with amazing imaginations that just sort of dwindle away as we age and are trained to do kind of boring jobs, but actually, imagination just grows as you know more about the world, because knowledge is the fodder for imagination. In order to conceive of a new possibility, you're basically tinkering with possibilities that you already know or have heard about from other people. And children just know so much less about the world, and thus the possibilities that children consider are much more limited than the possibilities adults consider. It's kind of a mystery why it is that children are thought to have such glorious imaginations. I mean, probably because they engage in like make believe, and they uh, will. uh, hold fantasy beliefs, like they'll believe in Santa Claus and so forth. Um, but if you really look at what they're doing when they're pretending, they're usually just simulating the adult world. They're not, they can engage with fantasy, but they don't particularly love fantasy. Fantasy is actually much more popular among adults in terms of like our own preferences for genre. And part of that difference is that little kids have yet to figure out the world itself, like actual reality. So they're actually most interested in just learning like what's true in the world. Once adults have got that kind of figured out, that's when their interests start to part and they want to explore like alternative realities. Um, yeah, so despite appearances, adults are actually the people that have very rich imaginations. Um, Another reason why we often overlook adults' imaginations is that we use our imaginations in the service of our professions, and it doesn't feel very imaginative to like write a paper or to design a new part for a machine or something. But a child couldn't do that. Children can't write papers. They can't. When they make drawings, they're pretty bad. They're not cultural innovators in the way that adults are cultural innovators. But we often our knowledge is very specialized. And so when you go off to work in this very small, narrow area, we stop thinking of what we're doing as imaginative because we're not just like playing fantasy games. But actually, we are doing something that requires a huge amount of imagination that's grounded in a solid base of knowledge.
And is there like a certain age range where like this imaginative capability like starts to decline, or is it dependent by person?
Um, yeah, there's probably not a specific time in which imagination either accelerates or decelerates. It probably depends on the context. And part of what makes a person imaginative in terms of like how they approach a problem is whether they're actively trying to generate a new possibility or they're content with taking advantage of possibilities they already know to be true. Like I'm just going to solve this problem the way I've always solved it, or actively trying to seek out like a novel solution that might be quicker or more efficient. So knowledge is one support to imagination, but also being reflective about your own thinking and problem solving and decision making. That also spurs imagination.
As a professor, how do you handle students' preconceptions in science classes? Some educators try to bridge from intuitive beliefs to scientific ones, while others confront those beliefs head on. You have noted that we cannot treat science as entirely intuitive or entirely counterintuitive, and that the mapping from intuition to truth must be figured out piecemeal. How do you apply this insight in your teaching, and can you give an example of when you built on a student's intuition as a stepping stone versus when you help them break away from a faulty notion?
Yeah, it's hard for me to pinpoint exactly when I do that. I mean, hopefully I'm doing it appropriately. I do in my own teaching like to like pump the students' intuitions. I'll often pose a problem or a question and I'll elicit their ideas and then we work from there. Sometimes I do that to demonstrate how the first ideas that spring to mind are actually not correct. Other times I try to show how they are, but we have to like work with them and develop them in more depth. Um, I mean, I can't think of a great example from my own teaching, but like a great example that I give in the book is an instructional sequence to get students to understand um, the normal force, which is that when an object is sitting on a surface, the surface is pushing up on the object. The object is pushing down by virtue of having weight, gravity pulling it down, and the surface is pushing up. It doesn't seem like a table is pushing up on anything. But you can get students to accept that the normal force is a real force by starting with surfaces that have more spring to them. Like what happens when you push your hand down on a spring? Clearly that you can feel the spring pushing back up. What if you put your hand on like a flexible piece of plywood? again, it's more solid than a spring, but you can still feel the push, and you can kind of work them all the way to a solid table, and people will be like, "Oh, I guess the table does push up on us." That would be a case of working with an intuition that we hold about springs and hands and moving to something that's totally counterintuitive, like the normal force of a table. There's other cases though where it's probably better just to sidestep the intuitions because you can't really work with them. Um, a good example of this is how we think about heat as like a kind of substance that moves in and out of objects, that you can trap or yeah, we think of it as a substance kind of like a liquid, but it's immaterial. And that's just not a good intuition to work with when you're trying to teach someone thermodynamics. A better thing to do is just to introduce the idea that a system is composed of molecules and the molecules are moving and the amount of motion corresponds to the heat. So rather than trying to move from like invisible liquids to get people to understand what heat really is, just like ignore that view and just start with the molecules. That's a more productive way of teaching thermodynamics.
Students often enter college seeing science as a collection of facts rather than a method of inquiry, and they may not naturally understand what evidence means in a scientific context. What approaches do you use to teach scientific thinking and evidence-based reasoning? Do you incorporate specific exercises or discussions to train students to evaluate evidence and think like scientists rather than just memorize information?
Yes, I do. Uh, yeah, and I think it's critical that science educators go into evidence. Anytime that I put describe a theory, we always then consider what evidence supports this theory. Why is this um, a common theory, a popular theory in the literature, as well as evidence against it? You know what? Because at least in psychology, a lot of our theories are at a stage where there's going to be revisions, and we're going to emerge with new theories 10 years from now, 50 years from now. Our main theories will probably look kind of different. Um, so yeah, but what it means to engage with evidence is also to engage with like methods, like how was this evidence generated? What were people doing? And so it's actually a bunch of things that you should try to point people's attention to. The data, but also like why people ran the experiments they did, how they ran those experiments, what are alternative methods, and do they generate consistent data or inconsistent data? And of course, when you're teaching a class, you only have so much time to actually go into the evidence in support of any given theory because you have to cover lots of theories. So it is a little bit of a balancing act to um, to not go into just go down a rabbit hole, but to give people a good sense of what the evidence might be, so that maybe in the future, when they come across this topic in their own life for some reason, they have a sense of like what methods people use to test these claims and what kinds of studies they might need to consult if they want more information.
At the beginning of your answer, you brought up how in like 30 years the the theories will be like completely different. Do you think this is true just for philosophy or for other sciences as well? Because like I find it almost like fascinating how like there's like so many people working making tests right now and and like in a few 10, 20 years these theories may be completely different. It also kind of makes me wonder is it even possible to get a philosophical theory 100% correct given that people are changing? Like,
Hmm. Um, Yeah, any scientific theory could be revised. That's the nature of science. There's never a point where we say, that's it, it's proven. But there's areas of science where it's more likely we're going to revise our theories than others, just given the amount of data we have in support of one theory or another. Uh, Part of the reason why psychology feels like an area where there's going to be a lot of change is because we haven't yet figured out how to connect mind and brain. Like we've got, fairly detailed cognitive theories, mental theories of behavior, and then there's also a pretty rich body of neuroscientific information, but connecting those two has been a challenge. And people have made attempts. I'm not saying it's like it's unknown, but I think as we start integrating mind and brain, there's going to be changes on both sides.
And would you agree that like human development is pretty rapid compared to other species, and that would make it more difficult to establish these theories?
You mean human development like
As in like the people like just 20 years ago didn't even know what a phone was, and nowadays everyone walks around with a phone.
yeah, no, I mean, the average person graduates from high school knowing things that people 100 years ago had no clue about, right? Like genetics was discovered only like 75 years, genes were discovered only 75 years ago. And think about like how much you need to know about genes in biology. It's like something you're introduced in middle school, and then you need to know like the detailed mechanics of how genes code for proteins, and proteins do this, and like it's very complicated. So everybody's kind of starting off in whatever line of work they pursue with with more knowledge, just broader knowledge and deeper knowledge than they have in the past. I guess not everyone, but
Yeah.
people who make it through the curriculum, they are, and so that probably will spur developments at a quicker rate.
You frequently share your work with broader audiences, including public talks that explain how intuitive beliefs can blind us to scientific truth. What have you found most challenging about communicating these complex ideas to the public and the media? Have experiences with public talks or interviews influenced how you think about your research or its presentation? How do you bridge the gap between academic findings and public understanding in your outreach?
Yeah, I think trying to engage with the public has changed the way I do my own science, my own research, in that Um, when I'm writing an academic paper, I will never write a sentence that I wouldn't be comfortable saying to someone who's not in my field. Like sometimes you have to use some technical jargon just to communicate with your peers, but there's so much academic work that's just opaque to someone outside the field. And even within the field, none of us like to read those kinds of papers. That, part of being a good scientist is being able to communicate what it is you're doing and what you found. And I think the challenge of doing that for people without any specialized training in my area has made me appreciate the need for doing that even within the specialized work itself.
One of your recent projects examines the development of cognitive reflection in children, which is the ability to override an intuitive response with a more analytical answer, and you have created a developmental version of the cognitive reflection test for kids. What have you discovered about how cognitive reflection develops in childhood? How does this reflective ability relate to children's grasp of counterintuitive scientific concepts? Do you think we can train young learners to be more reflective to improve their understanding of science?
Uh, yeah, so lots of questions there. First, let me just define cognitive reflection, which would be thinking about your own thinking. And more specifically, the way it's measured is by giving people brain teasers that elicit an intuitive response. But if you stop and think about it, you realize that answer can't be the right answer. It doesn't actually address the question. And so then you have to go back to the drawing board and come up with an alternative response that does answer the question. Um, Cognitive reflection was first studied in adults using brain teasers that are very math heavy. And so we developed a version where we could give brain teasers that work even for kindergartners. So a sample item is, what do cows drink? And that elicits the intuitive response of milk because of the association between cows and milk. But if you stop and think about it, they don't drink the milk they produce, they drink water. Um, and so we have this battery of 9 brain teasers that works really well, where generally the first answer that pops into your head is not the correct answer, but even kids have enough knowledge to be able to um, realize that that answer was wrong and come up with a different answer. And we find that between 5 and 12, which is the age range that targeted by this task, uh, kids get substantially more of these answers correct. And that cognitive reflection uh, correlates with their ability to perform other kinds of tasks. Like you already mentioned science. So kids who have higher cognitive reflection scores are better at understanding counterintuitive scientific ideas. They're also better at learning counterintuitive scientific ideas. And that's true even holding age constant. So sometimes very little kids can be cognitively reflective, and sometimes older kids are not particularly reflective. And it turns out like reflection usually makes a bigger impact than just how old you are and how much general experience you've had with the world. The reason why we've been pursuing cognitive reflection in children is because it's shown to be such an important predictor in adults of um, just reasoning accurately and without biases. So the more adults who are cognitively reflective, make fewer errors. They make decisions that are sort of more optimal. They are less superstitious. They understand science better. They are better, um, uh, like at cooperating with other people. They're better at avoiding stereotypes. There's all sorts of good things that go along with being cognitively reflective. But that was all done with adults, and our question was, well, how does cognitive reflection emerge? And is there a way that maybe instructionally you can facilitate reflection so that you can get some of the benefits of reflection at even earlier ages?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen trends on TikTok where people go around and ask random people these very simple questions, and that cow question is a very common one, I think. And
Yeah.
I myself fell for it, and but it amazed me because then when they went to ask the next questions, I was paying more attention, so I didn't get any of the other ones wrong. But it really just is about stopping for a second and thinking about what the question is. And I think, well, at least for me, I tend to be very responsive, like very quick. I try to respond as quickly as possible, and I guess it just taught me that like I, I think nowadays most of the time it's always better to stop and think before you speak or answer. So yeah, I think it's very interesting. Um, Looking ahead, what big questions are you most excited to explore next? Your work has spanned intuition, imagination, and reflection, which are all fundamental aspects of how we think. Are there new directions or applications of your research in psychology, education, or science communication that you envision in the future? How do you hope the insights from your studies will ultimately change the way we teach, learn, and communicate about science?
Right now, we're focused on media literacy and detecting misinformation on the internet. And what led me to that research topic was the cognitive reflection test, because it had been observed that adults who are cognitively reflective are better at identifying misinformation, which is so prevalent online. Misinformation spreads further and farther than true information on the same topic, um, and it seems to be having an impact on society. So we've been pursuing this topic just both for theoretical reasons, because misinformation, is another form of like intuitive processing, intuitive ideas, but also for practical reasons to like help children who are growing up in an age where they are going to be online all the time, to help immunize them from some of the false ideas that are going to be thrown at them as soon as they get on, they create social media accounts. So what we've been finding is that um, just like in adults, cognitively reflective children are better at identifying this information than children who are not as reflective. And that's true independent of age. So we've been looking at children who are too young to have social media accounts, at least according to like stated rules, kids under 13. So they haven't had hardly any experience on social media, and we've been presenting them with news stories that really were circulated on social media, some real and some fake. That is, some true stories and some false stories. And we've been finding that the kids who are just more cognitively reflective on their own do a better job at distinguishing the two kinds of stories. And what we're doing now is trying to figure out like ways to help all children, reflective or not, be better at identifying this information, like trainings that are helpful for processing news stories and thinking about them critically.
Um, I have one final question that we ask all of our interviewees, and it is, how do you define success?
For myself or for other people?
Both.
Um, Well, I think success for me as an academic is doing something that other people are interested in and care about and actually do kind of make some changes to the current theories of the day. In terms of like success in general, um, I, I I guess, there's the general thing of like you want to be happy, but also you want to find something that makes you feel valued and leads you to feel productive, whatever that might be. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.